Greetings, I am Eric, and this is the Commander's Beacon, and we'd like to discuss some unconventional ways to build commander decks. Today let's talk about Vadrok, Apex of Thunder. Vadrok is a 3/3 legendary elemental dinosaur cat that costs blue, red, white, but not really because you will never pay this cost unless something is going horribly wrong. Vadrok has flying and first strike. Also, Vadrok can and should be cast for its mutate cost of 1 Azorius red, because whenever this creature mutates, you may cast target non-creature card with mana value 3 or less from your graveyard without paying its mana cost. So Vadrok is one of the 5 Apex legendary 3-color creatures from the Ikoria set that features the mutate mechanic. The mutate appears on a select number of creatures in Ikoria and in the thematically related Commander 2020 set, and it lets you combine 2 or more creatures into a single, somewhat stronger creature so that your opponents will get even more value when they remove it. When you mutate creatures together, the single combined creature gets the text box abilities of all the creature cards combined, but the power and toughness will not similarly combine. You'll only get the power and toughness of a single one of those creatures of your choosing, along with the color, creature type, mana cost, etc. I'm not going to say too much more about the mutate mechanic because I already did a full video dedicated entirely to the mechanic, so check that out if you want more information. So the goal of this deck is to trigger Vadrok's mutate ability as many times as possible so that we can repeatedly cast non-creature spells with mana value 3 or less from our graveyard for free. Now note that this ability is not just limited to instants and sorceries. We can also recast artifacts, enchantments like sagas, and even planeswalkers if they cost 3 or less. And note that when we do cast this card from our graveyard with Vadrok, we don't exile it, so we can recast the same spell again and again and again. So there's actually a lot of different directions you could go when building around Vadrok, but before we get to that, we need to be able to mutate a creature repeatedly. And this is not an easy task. At first, it costs a lot of mana. And secondly, like we said, a mutated creature stack is a juicy target for our opponent's removal spells, so we need to be able to protect our mutated creature. And third, beyond all of that, there are only so many mutate creatures available to us, especially since we're not playing with all 5 colors. So we'll need to be able to recur and recast our mutate creatures for their mutate costs repeatedly. So our deck will need a few key components to get our strategy going. Fortunately, a couple of these problems have the same solution, and that is creatures that can bounce themselves back to our hand. Blinking Spirit, for example, is a 2/2 that costs 3 and a white, and it has pay 0, return Blinking Spirit to its owner's hand. If we mutate Vadrok onto Blinking Spirit, and we use Blinking Spirit's ability to bounce itself back to our hand, then Vadrok, and all other creatures mutated onto it, will come back to our hand with it. And then we can recast those creatures and get their mutate triggers again. And because Blinking Spirit can bounce itself, it's going to be a lot harder for our opponents to remove it, so we've got excellent protection for our mutated creature stack. With white and blue especially, we've got a decent number of creatures to choose from that can bounce themselves back to our hand, and the most important qualities in these creatures is a low casting cost, since we'll be casting them repeatedly, and a low cost to activate their self-bounce ability. Because our strategy is very mana hungry, I actually prefer self-bouncing creatures that don't cost any mana to activate, like Blinking Spirit, and even Thalako's Scout, which requires that we discard a card. It can be preferable over paying a mana or 2 to bounce the creature, because we just need so much mana with this deck. So now we've got a way to repeatedly get mutate triggers, and to protect our mutated creature stack by mutating onto these self-bouncing creatures. But we will also need more mutate creatures. Vadrok's ability triggers whenever this creature mutates. So that means I can mutate other creatures onto the creature, and I'll trigger Vadrok's ability each time I do so, as well as triggering the mutate ability of each other mutate trigger that's on that creature. For example, let's say I cast Blinking Spirit, and then I mutate Vadrok onto it. I'll get Vadrok's ability to cast a non-creature spell with mana value 3 or less from my graveyard. Then let's say I mutate Dreamtail Heron onto that creature. Dreamtail Heron is another mutate creature that has, whenever this creature mutates, draw a card. So I'll get to draw a card, and I'll get to cast another spell from my graveyard with Vadrok because, guess what, our creature mutated again. Now let's say I mutate Cubwarden onto our creature. And this is another mutate creature, and it has, whenever this creature mutates, create 2 1/1 white cat creature tokens with lifelink. Great, so I'll make a couple of cats, and I'll also draw a card from Dreamtail Heron, and cast yet another non-creature spell with mana value 3 or less from my graveyard with Vadrok. So with one of our self-blinking creatures and 3 mutate creatures, we've triggered a bunch of mutate abilities, letting us make 2 1/1 cat tokens, draw 2 cards, and cast 3 non-creature spells with mana value 3 or less from our graveyard for free. So the more creatures we can mutate onto a single creature, you can see that our mutate triggers can get really out of control. And then we can bounce Blinking Spirit back to our hand, which bounces all of the mutate creatures with it, and then we can recast them and do it all again. Okay, so let's quickly go on a tangent here. Bouncing and recasting our creatures requires a bunch of mana. But we need to do it this way. If we were to, say, flicker the mutated creature stack, then each creature would return to the battlefield as an individual creature. Nothing would mutate, and we wouldn't get any mutate triggers. So bouncing and recasting the creatures for their mutate cost is really the only way to repeatedly trigger mutate abilities. Okay, I guess you could use sacrifice effects and graveyard recursion, but not so much in Jeskai colors, so anyways, you get the point. So now we can repeatedly get our mutate triggers, not just from Vadrok, but from other mutate creatures in our deck as well. Well, again, as long as we have absurd amounts of mana to keep bouncing and recasting our creatures. And there's 2 things we can do to help make this mana cost more manageable. First, we'll use cost reducers. There's a few artifacts that can reduce the generic mana cost of spells we cast, or sometimes just creature spells, but that's really what we care about anyways. Kefnet's Monument, for example, is a 3 mana artifact that reduces the cost of all blue creature spells we cast by 1 generic mana, and it gives us a little bonus whenever we cast a creature spell too. We can make target creature and opponent controls not untap during its controller's next untap step. Since we're going to be casting creatures a lot, because when you cast a creature for its mutate cost, that counts, this triggered ability can actually do a lot of work. But of course we're really using Kefnet's Monument to reduce the cost of our creature spells, and again that includes mutate costs. So with Kefnet's Monument in play, we'll only need to spend Azorius Red to cast Vadrok for its mutate cost. Now unfortunately all of our cost reducers only reduce the generic mana cost of spells, not the colored mana cost. So Vadrok's mutate cost will never drop below 3 mana, but some of our other mutate creatures will get more benefit, like a Dreamtail Heron, whose mutate cost can be reduced from 3 and a blue to as low as just a single blue if we have enough cost reducers in play. So even with these cost reducers, we won't be able to cast, mutate, and bounce our creatures indefinitely. If we want to approach that possibility, we'll need to use mana generators that we can cast for free from our graveyard with Vadrok that can generate colored mana. Frantic Search, for example, is an instant that costs 2 and a blue. You draw 2 cards, then discard 2 cards, and untap up to 3 lands. So when you cast this normally, you'll typically tap 3 lands to pay for it, then untap those lands when it resolves, so it's basically free, but you won't be generating any mana. But when Frantic Search is in your graveyard and you cast it for free whenever Vadrok mutates, this means you'll effectively generate 3 mana, or more if any of your lands can tap for more than 1, every time you mutate Vadrok, or mutate another creature onto a stack that Vadrok is a part of. With a sufficient combination of cost reducers and mutate creatures, these mana generating spells could potentially allow you to generate net mana from mutating so that you may be able to create infinite mutate triggers. Well, not with Frantic Search specifically, since then you'd draw your whole deck and kill yourself unless you play Thassa's Oracle or something, but we're not doing that, so we would just die instead. But anyways, we have other mana generators that could go infinite, and we'll get to those later. But now we have our game plan. We will use self-bouncing creatures to enable repeated mutation, we'll use Vadrok and other mutate creatures to get that repeated mutation and generate value, and we'll use cost reducers and mana generating spells that Vadrok can cast from the graveyard to pay for this mana-hungry strategy, possibly allowing us to generate infinite mana, and as a result, infinite mutate triggers. But even if we don't quite reach infinity, we don't really need it in order to get enough value to win the game. So with that strategy in mind, let's talk about the contents of the deck, starting with the spells that we're going to cast repeatedly with Vadrok's mutate trigger. We'll need to use Vadrok's triggered mutate ability to cast spells from our graveyard that help us keep on mutating our creatures and bouncing them back to our hands and mutating them again. So we'll need spells that generate mana. Brood Birthing is a sorcery that costs 1 and a red, and it says if you control an Eldrazi spawn, create 3/0/1 colorless Eldrazi spawn creature tokens that have sacrifice this creature, add a colorless to your mana pool. Otherwise, create one of those tokens. So the first time you cast this, you'll create 1 Eldrazi spawn, which is essentially worth 1 colorless mana. But the next time you cast it, assuming you still have that 1 spawn sitting around, you'll make 3 more Eldrazi spawn, which means you'll essentially gain 3 more colorless mana. Now our colorless mana won't completely eliminate mutate costs, because again we need colored mana, but it will help, and these 0/1 creature tokens can also gum up the battlefield and chump block for us if necessary too. But we still have plenty of options to generate colored mana. We already mentioned Frantic Search, which generally generates 3 mana of the color of our choice, depending on which lands we have on the field, by untapping 3 lands when it resolves. But there's more like this too. There's Snap, which is an instant that costs 1 and a blue, and you get to return target creature to its owner's hand, and untap 2 lands. So again, we generate 2 mana. Unlike Frantic Search, Snap won't give us card selection, but we can bounce our mutated stack back to our hand to cast it again, or of course we can just cast Snap offensively as removal against our opponent's creatures. Now the 2 mana that Snap effectively generates won't typically let us mutate indefinitely, but we will get a ton of value from it along the way. We'll also play Open the Omenpaths. This is an instant that costs 2 and a red, and it lets you choose one. Either you add 2 mana of any one color, and 2 mana of any other color to your mana pool. Spend this mana only to cast creatures or enchantment spells. Or you can choose to have creatures you control get +1/+0 until end of turn. So Open the Omenpaths is great here. This generates 4 mana. They can only be used on creature spells, but that's fine because that's what we want it for anyways. But don't ignore the second mode of this card. There will be occasions in which we've generated a lot of creature tokens, and casting Open the Omenpaths repeatedly can generate a lot of power for us in combat. But mostly this card is here for the mana generation, and it's great at that. Of course, we'll also play Jeska's Will. This is a sorcery that costs 2 and red, and you get to choose one or both if you control your commander. First, you can add red for each card in target opponent's hand. Second, you can exile the top 3 cards of your library, and you may play them this turn. So Jeska's Will is already awesome in pretty much any deck that has access to red. But we don't just have red, we also have Synergy. We can cast Jeska's Will repeatedly and generate maybe 4 or 6 or more mana every time we cast it, depending on how many cards our opponents have in their hands. And as long as Vadrok is mutated somewhere onto one of our creatures, even if it isn't on top, it still counts as us controlling our commander, so we'll get both modes of Jeska's Will. The only thing we'll need to be aware of is that Jeska's Will only generates red mana, so it will be pretty hard to go infinite with this one alone. Vadrok requires at least 1 blue or white mana to mutate, and we've only got 3 other creatures in the deck that can mutate with only red mana. But this will effectively draw us a bunch of cards, at least temporarily, and give us a bunch of mana, even if we can't necessarily go infinite with our mutate triggers. There's also Birgi, God of Storytelling. This is a 3 mana, 3/3 god creature, and Birgi has add red whenever you cast a spell. Of course, this includes casting spells with Vadrok from your graveyard. So Birgi is sort of like one of our cost reducers, but instead of actually reducing the cost, she just refunds us 1 mana whenever we cast a spell, rather than again reducing that cost. But it's actually even better, because Vadrok casts a spell from your graveyard whenever it mutates. But casting the mutate creature is also casting a spell. And Birgi doesn't care what type of spell you cast. All spells refund 1 red mana. That means for each mutate spell we cast, if we're also getting a Vadrok trigger, then Birgi will be adding 2 red mana that we can use to help fuel our engine. And this is on top of our other cost reducers and mana generating spells that Vadrok can cast from the graveyard. And Birgi is an MDFC too. The backside of the card is Harnfell, Horn of Bounty. It costs 4 and a red, and it lets you discard a card to exile the top 2 cards of your library. You may play those cards this turn. And Harnfell is just fine. There are times when we want to discard things in our deck, and there are also times when, at the very least, we won't mind discarding, because Vadrok can cast some of those cards from our graveyard. So Harnfell is fine, but the front side of Birgi is so good for our deck that we'll rarely ever play Harnfell, even if it's not a bad card at all. So those are some of the cards that we can repeatedly cast with Vadrok to generate mana to keep our engine going. But one of the really cool things we can do with Vadrok's mutate trigger is we can cast spells that have no mana cost. Now a lot of these spells that have no mana cost can't actually be cast, and this is different from having a mana cost of 0. Ancestral Vision, for example, has no mana cost. You can't cast it, but it has Suspend 4 for 1 blue mana, so you can suspend it, and when it resolves, target player draws 3 cards. So again, normally you can only suspend this card. Waiting 4 turns to draw 3 cards is only okay. But if you could cast Ancestral Vision right now, then Ancestral Vision is actually Ancestral Recall, a 1-mana draw 3 at instant speed, which is a $650 card that's almost banned everywhere. That's really good. And when Ancestral Vision is in our graveyard and we trigger Vadrok's mutate ability, we can cast Ancestral Vision without paying its mana cost, which is good because it doesn't have one. But that means that our Vadrok trigger will see that mana cost as 0, which is less than 3, so we can cast it. And we don't need to suspend it and wait, we can cast it right now. So this is absurdly powerful. With Vadrok's mutate trigger, we can play these throwbacks to insanely powerful old Magic cards like Ancestral Recall by casting something like Ancestral Vision without paying its mana cost. And honestly, abusing cards like this is one of the most fun parts of the deck, because it feels like you're playing with these really expensive, overpowered cards, but all of these suspend cards with no mana cost are actually really budget friendly. I'm running a few in this deck, and Ancestral Vision is by far the most expensive, and it's only $6 or $7. But like I said, it's not the only one. We've also got Lotus Bloom, in case you ever wanted to simulate the most powerful and expensive card in Magic, Black Lotus. Lotus Bloom is an artifact with no mana cost, and it has Suspend 3 for 0 mana, and you can tap and sacrifice it to add 3 mana of any one color, just like Black Lotus. So again, if you have Lotus Bloom in your graveyard, Vadrok gives you access to a repeatable Black Lotus. Just mutate Vadrok and cast your Lotus Bloom for free, sacrifice it for 3 mana of whatever color you want, use that mana to mutate your next creature, that'll trigger Vadrok and let you cast Lotus Bloom again, and of course it'll trigger the mutate ability of whatever other mutate creature you just cast if it has one. So again, sacrifice that Lotus Bloom for more mana, mutate more creatures, or bounce your Blinking Spirit or whatnot to your hand, and start all over again. Lotus Bloom is one of the best ways in this deck to get infinite mutate triggers, since it generates 3 mana of any single color we want. We have 4 mutate creatures in this deck that can mutate for 3 mana or less, but once we have a cost reducer or 2, that number goes way up. But we still have more 0 mana spells that I want to talk about. There's Restore Balance, which simulates balance. Restore Balance is a sorcery that again has no mana cost. It has Suspend 6 for a single white mana, and it says, each player chooses a number of lands they control equal to the number of lands controlled by the player who controls the fewest, then sacrifices the rest. Players sacrifice creatures and discard cards the same way. So this is a pseudo board wipe for lands and creatures and cards in hand. But first of all, you should never suspend this. Even the most powerful AI in the world probably can't predict whether or not you'll want to board wipe 6 turns from now, or if the game will even still be going on. But of course, you can cast it immediately from your graveyard with Vadrok. Now, because we're mutating a lot of creatures together, we'll often have just a single creature on the battlefield, so Restore Balance can be an effective board wipe for our opponent's creatures. And since we don't have access to green in this deck, we'll rarely have the most lands on the battlefield, so Restore Balance should often hurt our opponent's mana bases harder than our own. Now, Balance isn't super expensive, but it is banned almost anywhere and it's very powerful, so it's pretty cool to have this suspend version of it in Restore Balance. But we also need to talk about Inevitable Betrayal. This is a spicy new one from Modern Horizons 2, which doesn't really emulate an old Magic card, but it's still really powerful, and very easy on the budget. This is a sorcery, again, no mana cost, it has Suspend 3 for 1 blue, and it says, search target opponent's library for a creature card and put that card onto the battlefield under your control, then that player shuffles. So this is hilarious. Now, suspending an Inevitable Betrayal isn't a good way to make friends, but if you cast it right now from your graveyard, 3 times in 1 turn, at that point you don't even need friends. I don't really have much else to say about this card. It's powerful, it's obvious, it's hilarious, and you can abuse it. And right now it's less than $1. But let's move on to Wheel of Fate, which emulates Wheel of Fortune. A Wheel of Fate has Suspend 4 for 1 and a red, and it says each player discards their hand, then draws 7 cards. Now, I actually didn't include Wheel of Fate in the deck yet, but it could be worth it. I just haven't playtested it yet. And discarding our hand into our graveyard isn't actually that bad for us, since again, Vadrok can cast a lot of our cards from our graveyard, so Wheel of Fate might work pretty well. That said, we do need to be careful about pitching our mutate creatures into the graveyard. They're a lot harder for us to recur in this deck since Vadrok can't recur creatures, or cast creatures, and we only have 11 mutate creatures, so it's not like we can afford to waste them. Now with Wheel of Fate, we could even go down the whole Wheels theme deck route and include stuff like Bralin Skyshark Rider to kill our opponents as we mill through our deck by recasting Wheel of Fate repeatedly with Vadrok triggers. Again, I didn't go this route with the deck, but you might consider it. So these are some of the 0 mana suspend cards that pack a lot of power and really make this deck feel more powerful than it should be. The only downside with these cards is that whether you suspend them from your hand or put them into your graveyard to cast with Vadrok, your opponents will see them coming, so they will be able to get ready for them, so just be aware of that. But now let's talk about the mutating and self-bouncing creatures that we're using in this deck. So in this deck, we will really generate value when we mutate as many creatures as we can onto a single creature to get compounding mutate triggers for each mutate creature we add. So naturally, we'll want to run all of the mutate creatures that we can, except for the really bad ones. There are a total of 11 in this deck, not counting the commander. I'm not going to go over all of them since they're pretty self-explanatory, but you can see a link to the full deck list in the description for more details. At the lower mana value range, we have creatures like Huntmaster Liger, which mutates for 2 and a white, and whenever the creature mutates, other creatures you control get +X/+X until end of turn, where X is the number of times this creature has mutated. We generally won't have many creatures on the battlefield, so this effect will often go to waste, but it's a mutate trigger at a relatively low cost, so we'll take it. And we do have some creature token generators, so there is the possibility that Huntmaster Liger can act as sort of an overrun for our team. I just don't plan on this happening all the time. Souvenir Snatcher costs us twice as much at 6 total mana to mutate, a 5 and a blue, but when it mutates we get to steal an opponent's artifact, which is great. There's Lord Drakus, which helps us recur spells from our graveyard to our hand when it mutates. Majestic Oricon gains us life, Dreamtail Heron draws us cards, but all of that is really obvious. So again, I'm not going to mention all of our mutate creatures, but I do want to specifically talk about Pouncing Shore Shark and Sea Dasher Octopus. These have mutate and flash. A Sea Dasher Octopus has the lowest mutate cost in our deck at only 1 and a blue, and it doesn't do anything when it mutates, but it does cause you to draw a card whenever it deals combat damage to a player. And Pouncing Shore Shark bounces a creature an opponent controls back to its owner's hand when it mutates for a cost of 3 and a blue. This is good removal, but again what I'm really excited about here is flash, because with Sea Dasher Octopus and Pouncing Shore Shark, I can mutate onto one of my creatures at instant speed, perhaps a creature that already has Vadrok mutated onto it. And that lets me use Vadrok's triggered ability to cast something from my graveyard at instant speed. Like a counterspell if I don't have one in my hand but I do have one in my graveyard, or a board wipe, or inevitable betrayal to steal an opponent's creature from their library at instant speed. What's really cool about these flash mutate creatures is that you can hold up mana for them to use during your opponent's turn to cast any non-creature spell with mana value 3 or less from your graveyard whenever you want. Again, just as long as you have Vadrok on the field first. Now I also want to mention Cloud Piercer. This is a bad mutate creature. It's 5 mana for a 5/4 with reach, or you can mutate it for 3 and a red. And when this creature mutates, you may discard a card. If you do, you draw a card. And this is obviously worse than Dreamtail Heron, which just draws you a card when it mutates for the same total mana cost. But Cloud Piercer does have some value here. If I have one of my 0 mana suspend cards, like Restore Balance, in my hand, I can discard it to Cloud Piercer when it mutates. And then if I'm mutating onto a creature that also has Vadrok mutated onto it, I can cast that spell that I just discarded. And I can actually do this right away by ordering the stack of my mutate ability triggers so that Cloud Piercer's ability resolves before Vadrok's mutate trigger resolves. So when I've got one of these cards in my hand, like Restore Balance, Cloud Piercer basically lets me cast it without broadcasting to my opponents what I'll be doing, and they'll have very little time to respond. But besides cool uses like that, just having a way to pitch any of our cards into our graveyard is just fine in this deck, because, again, Vadrok will be able to cast those cards from our graveyard for free. So normally I wouldn't advocate running Cloud Piercer in any deck, even a mutate deck, but I think it deserves a spot here. Now let's move on to the self-bouncing creatures. First, of course, we'll play Crystal Shard, which is a 3-mana artifact that can bounce any of our creatures by paying a blue mana and tapping it, but we'll often rely on creatures that can bounce themselves back to our hand. Blinking Spirit, Thalico Scout, Skywing Aven, these are our preferred choices because they don't charge us mana to bounce the creature back to our hand. Yes, Thalico Scout and Skywing Aven make us discard a card, but again, it's generally much easier to discard a card in this deck than it is to pay an extra mana. And again, there are some cards that we may want to discard since Vadrok can cast them from the graveyard. But there aren't a ton of creatures that can bounce themselves back to our hand, so we'll also use creatures like Escape Artist, Darting Merfolk, Brightling. These each cost 1 mana to return to our hand, and unfortunately it's colored mana. Either a single blue for Escape Artist and Darting Merfolk, or a single white for Brightling. And that's unfortunate because we really need to be careful about how we use our colored mana, since our mutate costs can be very color intensive, especially when we use our cost reducers to reduce the generic costs of our creature spells. Speaking of cost reducers, let's talk about those next. Like I said, generating mana from the spells that we cast out of our graveyard with Vadrok, even the most efficient ones like Lotus Bloom and Open the Omenpaths, these won't often allow us to generate infinite mutate triggers all by themselves. We'll often need some additional cost reducer to make our mutations even more efficient. So of course, we'll play Poliwag Symbiote. This is a staple in any mutate-themed deck that has access to blue, and this deck is no exception. Poliwag Symbiote is a 1/3 frog that costs 1 and a blue, and it has each creature spell you cast cost 1 less to cast if it has mutate. It also has whenever you cast a creature spell, if it has mutate, draw a card, then discard a card. So this is exactly what we need. Our mutate costs are reduced by 1 generic mana, and we get some card selection whenever we mutate, and this is really great too because again, Poliwag Symbiote is letting us discard cards, and we really want to discard those 0 mana spells like Inevitable Betrayal if it's in our hand, so we can cast it with Vadrok. We'll also use Cloud Key and Helm of Awakening. Both of these function similarly. They're artifacts that reduce the cost of our spells by 1 generic mana. Cloud Key forces us to pick a card type, and spells we cast of the chosen type cost 1 less. Of course, we'll pick creatures. Helm of Awakening reduces the cost of all spells by 1 generic mana, including our opponent's spells, so we'll need to be a bit careful with this, but once we get our engine going, we should be getting more value from Helm of Awakening than our opponents generally will. Or of course, we can just wait to cast it until we're ready to go infinite, and then our opponents really won't get much use out of it at all. And lastly, let's talk about monuments from Amonkhet. There's Hazoret's Monument, Kefnet's Monument, and Oketra's Monument. And these are all artifacts that cost 3 mana, and they reduce the cost of red, blue, and white creature spells you cast, respectively, by 1 generic mana. So each of these monuments only cares about creatures of a single color, so there is a chance that you'll just happen to have, mutate creatures that aren't affected by a given monument, like if you have Dreamtail Heron and Sea Dasher Octopus along with Oketra's Monument, then you won't get any cost reduction. Unfortunately, any of the monuments will reduce Vadrok's cost since Vadrok is all 3 colors. And each monument has an ability that triggers whenever we cast a creature spell, so we can still get value from all of them. And casting a creature for its mutate cost, again, still counts as casting a creature spell, so we can end up triggering these monuments several times per turn or more. Hazoret's Monument lets you discard a card in order to draw a card. Again, we have those suspend cards we want to pitch into our graveyard anyways, and most of our cards can be cast from the graveyard with Vadrok's triggered ability, so this is great. Kefnet's Monument lets you prevent target creature and opponent controls from untapping during its next untap step. And note that this trigger won't actually tap the creature, but if it's already tapped, you can probably prevent it from ever untapping again. And Oketra's Monument creates a 1/1 white soldier creature token with Vigilance whenever you cast a creature spell, and we can actually create quite a few tokens with this. So I've really liked these Amonkhet monuments, but I couldn't find a good place for them until now. I think they fit perfectly into this deck. But those are our cost reducers. Let's talk about some of the other synergistic interactions that we'll get to take advantage of with Vadrok. So Vadrok enables us to procure pretty much anything other than lands or creatures from our graveyard. And our self-bouncing creatures can make it very hard for our opponents to kill any creatures that we've mutated onto them. But it is still possible for our mutate creatures to end up in the graveyard. Now, we might be forced to discard them, our mutate creatures can still be counterspelled, or our opponents can cast removal on one of our self-bouncing creatures in response to us trying to mutate onto it. forcing us to bounce that creature back to our hand right away to protect it. Then that mutate creature will just resolve as a creature without mutating, since its target is no longer available to mutate onto, and then the mutate creature will be really vulnerable to actually being removed. So the point is that with only 11 mutate creatures in this deck, we'll want at least some chance of being able to recover them from the graveyard. So we'll play Remember the Fallen. This is a sorcery that costs 2 and a blue, and it lets you return target creature card and/or target artifact card from your graveyard to your hand. Now Vadrok can't recover your mutate creatures from the graveyard, but Remember the Fallen can. And Vadrok can repeatedly cast Remember the Fallen from your graveyard, since it's a 9-creature spell with mana value 3 or less, so this is perfect. We'll also use Underworld Cookbook. This is a new one for Modern Horizons 2. It's an artifact that costs 1. You tap it and discard a card to make a food token. Again, we love discarding at least some of the cards in this deck, so this is fine. But we're really playing Underworld Cookbook for its second ability. You can pay 4 and tap and sacrifice it to return target creature card from your graveyard to your hand. So this is more creature recursion on a spell that Vadrok can recast from your graveyard. And the Underworld Cookbook is even considerate enough to put itself in the graveyard after you use it, so Vadrok can get it back in case we need to use it again. Now, one of the most challenging aspects of playing this deck is assembling all of the pieces that you need to support your mutate engine. Because ideally we want probably at least 2 to 3 mutating creatures, a self-bouncing creature, some spell that Vadrok can cast from the graveyard that generates mana, and probably at least 1 mana cost reducer. And with so many pieces that we need to have in our deck, we might only have 6 or 10 options for a given role in the entire deck. So I've selected card draw spells for this deck that really help us find what we need. I've prioritized spells that let us see as much of the deck as possible with the card draw, rather than filling my hand with as many cards as possible. For example, at the low end of the curve we have Ponder and Preordain. At only a single mana each, these let us see the top 2 to 3 cards of our deck, even if they technically only replace themselves and don't give us true card advantage. Anticipate, Impulse, and Shimmer of Possibility are similar. These are 2-mana instants and sorceries that let us look at the top 3 or 4 cards of our library and put one of them into our hand, and the rest on the bottom. Again, since we're only adding 1 card to our hand, we're just making card parity rather than generating card advantage. But we do get to dig 3 to 4 cards deep in our deck to find what we really need. We have other card draw spells in the deck, these are just examples, but most are similar to these, the low-cost mana spells that let us filter through our deck to find specific pieces. And of course, Vadrok can cast all of these from the graveyard if we need to use them again. But I do want to talk about one of our other card draw cards too, and that's Mystic Remora. This is an enchantment that costs blue, it has cumulative upkeep of 1, and it says whenever an opponent casts a non-creature spell, you may draw a card unless that player pays 4. Mystic Remora is dumb. It's arguably as good as Rhystic Study, and even if it's not, it's pretty close. You draw a card whenever an opponent casts a non-creature spell, because most of the time no one is paying 4 mana to stop that. And if we were playing fair Magic, then Mystic Remora's cumulative upkeep cost would eventually get too high, and we'd eventually sacrifice it and stop drawing cards. But since Mystic Remora is a non-creature spell with mana value 3 or less, Vadrok's mutate ability will just let us recast it from our graveyard, effectively resetting its age counters and letting us keep drawing cards the whole game, or until it gets exiled. So Mystic Remora is already a really great card, but it's even better here. Now outside of card draw, I want to mention God Eternal Oketra. This is a 3/6 zombie god that costs 3 white. It has double strike, and whenever you cast a creature spell, create a 4/4 black zombie warrior creature token with vigilance. Also, whenever God Eternal Oketra dies or is put into exile from the battlefield, you may put it into its owner's library, 3rd from the top. So God Eternal Oketra is really hard for our opponents to remove, at least permanently remove, and it gives us a 4/4 zombie token with vigilance every time we cast a creature spell. Of course, that includes mutate spells. Even if we haven't managed to generate infinite colored mana for infinite mutates, it's fairly trivial in this deck to mutate 2 or 3 times per turn, and that means we can also fairly easily generate 2 to 3 4/4s every turn, or more. So God Eternal Oketra is definitely a possible win condition in this deck, and again it's pretty difficult for our opponents to get rid of. I've also selected removal spells that we can cast from our graveyard with Vadrok's mutate trigger. Slaughter the Strong is a sorcery that costs 1 white. It says each player chooses any number of creatures they control with total power 4 or less, then sacrifices all other creatures they control. Depending on which creature we put on top of our mutate stack, our mutated creature might survive Slaughter the Strong. And even if it doesn't, we can just bounce that creature back to our hand to save it anyways. We won't typically have a bunch of creatures, again, unless our mutate engine is going and we're making a lot of tokens, so Slaughter the Strong is perfect for this deck. Out of Time is a new fun one for Modern Horizons 2. It's an enchantment that costs 1 white, and when it enters the battlefield, you untap all creatures, then phase them out until Out of Time leaves the battlefield. Put a time counter on Out of Time for each creature phased out this way. And Out of Time has Vanishing, so when that last time counter is removed, you sacrifice Out of Time, and you remove one of those time counters during your upkeep. So this is awesome. Out of Time gets rid of all the creatures, except our mutated stack, we bounce it back to our hand, and those creatures are phased out. They're not in the graveyard to be recurred, they aren't exiled, so when they, if they re-enter the battlefield later, they won't generate enter the battlefield effects. They just cease to exist until Out of Time is removed. And Out of Time can last for a very long time since it gets 1 vanishing counter for each creature it phased out. By the way, this includes tokens, since creature tokens can phase out. And when Out of Time does finally lose all of its vanishing counters or just gets removed, you can just cast it again from your graveyard with Vadrok. And of course we can play Oblivion Stone. This is a 3-mana artifact that lets you pay 4 and tap it to put a fate counter on target permanent, or you can pay 5 and tap it to destroy each non-land permanent without a fate counter on it, then remove all fate counters from all permanents. Most importantly, we can recast Oblivion Stone from our graveyard with Vadrok. And lastly, I want to mention Burning Vengeance. Now, this is a 3-mana enchantment, and it says whenever you cast a spell from your graveyard, Burning Vengeance deals 2 damage to any target. So we can throw around some decent incremental damage with this. Like I said, if we're mutating 2 to 3 times per turn, which is fairly trivial, we can pressure our opponent's life totals or just start removing small problem creatures or planeswalkers. We can even use Burning Vengeance to win the game if we're able to mutate infinitely, even if none of those mutate triggers themselves actually provide game-winning value. And again, Burning Vengeance is an enchantment. It has mana value 3 or less, so we can recast it from the graveyard if our opponents remove it, with Vadrok's triggered ability. So that is the deck. Now let's go over the deck stats and cost. Alright, deck stats. This deck's average mana value is a nice brisk 2.66. We have 35 lands. There are 11 creatures with mutate, not counting the commander. This deck has a pretty impressive 43 non-creature, non-land cards with mana value 3 or less, which Vadrok can cast for us from the graveyard. There are 10 creatures that can bounce themselves back to your hand, or other spells that accomplish the same goal, like Crystal Shard and Snap. We have 6 cards that we can cast from the graveyard with Vadrok's mutate ability to generate mana. And there are 7 effects that reduce the mana cost of our spells, whether that's all of our spells like Helm of Awakening, or just creature spells of a specific color like the Amonkhet Monuments, and I'm counting Birgi here as well since she's sort of a cost reducer. There are 10 card draw cards and 11 mana ramp cards, though I am counting the cost reducers as ramp, so there's actually 6 pieces of ramp cards that are distinct from the cost reducers. And finally we have 9 pieces of single target removal and 4 board wipes. At the time of this recording, this deck has a value of $135.93 on TCGplayer.com. Now, I didn't plan any lower or higher budget versions of this deck, but I did sort through and test a fairly large number of cards to narrow the list down to just 100 for the deck. There's a lot of really enticing cards that you could put in this deck, and there just isn't space for all of them. So I want to talk about some of the notable cards that I did not include in the deck. Some of these didn't quite go in the direction I wanted the deck to go, some of them cost too much mana, some didn't work as well as I had hoped during testing, and some I just haven't had the opportunity to test yet, so they might work well, and I just don't know about it. But let's discuss those cards now that I chose not to include, but could be a good fit if you like them. First, there's River Kelpie. This creature draws you a card whenever it or another permanent enters the battlefield from a graveyard, or whenever a player casts a spell from a graveyard. It also has Persist, so you can get a lot of card draw value from River Kelpie. I chose not to include it just because it's 5 mana, which is a lot, and it doesn't mutate or bounce itself. Vadrok can't cast it from the graveyard, and I just had limited deck spaces available for it just because we need a lot of pieces to get our strategy working. but River Kelpie is still a good card that you might want to try out. Similarly, there's Whirlwind of Thought and Vega the Watcher. Whirlwind of Thought is an enchantment that costs 4 mana, so Vadrok can't cast it from the graveyard, and it draws you a card whenever you cast a non-creature spell. Vega the Watcher is a creature that draws you a card whenever you cast a spell from anywhere other than your hand, including, of course, casting something from your graveyard with Vadrok's trigger. And both of these are good card draw, but I just couldn't find slots for them in the deck. They also tend to only provide much value when our Mutate engine is already going, and by that point we're already probably drawing enough cards. But again, these two could be worth it if you're interested. Next I want to mention Grinning Ignis. This is a 3-mana 2/2 that lets you pay red and return it to your hand, and when you do, you generate 1 red and 2 colorless mana. But you can only activate this ability as a sorcery. Now having our bounce creature actually generate mana rather than costing mana is really cool, but since you can only bounce at sorcery speed, I found it far too risky and I didn't include Grinning Ignis. Finally, there's creatures that damage our opponents when we cast spells, like Gutter Snipe or Firebrand Archer. Gutter Snipe deals 2 damage to each opponent whenever you cast an instant or sorcery, and Firebrand Archer deals 1 damage to each opponent whenever you cast any non-creature spell. These cards could work out just fine in this deck, but we already have Burning Vengeance. Burning Vengeance is less vulnerable since it isn't a creature. Burning Vengeance can be recurred from our graveyard if someone removes it with our Vadrok trigger, so I just couldn't justify creatures like Gutter Snipe in this deck. But again, they could work really well. So that's my take on Vadrok Mutate. This deck can take some long, dirtly turns, so just be aware of that, but it's also a fairly low budget deck that gets to play with some really powerful cards like Lotus Bloom and Inevitable Betrayal, cards that feel like they're really expensive. And even outside of these cards, we get to play with a lot of unique stuff in this deck, like Underworld Cookbook and Open the Omenpaths, stuff that you just won't see a lot in other decks. And this deck definitely can go infinite to win the game, but it isn't easy. It generally requires 4 to 5 combo pieces, but again, even if you don't get to go infinite, you can still mutate a large number of times and generate enough value to win the game. And this deck is very resilient. Your mutate creatures will be hard to deal with because they can bounce back to your hand, and Vadrok can literally cast all of your non-creature, non-land cards from your graveyard. So outside of things like graveyard removal, it will be very hard for your opponents to permanently interact with your deck in any meaningful way. But that is Vadrok Mutate, and that's all I've got for today. If you enjoyed this deck tech, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. I try to make unconventional commander deck builds that use existing mechanics or commanders in new and unique ways. And thank you for watching.